on today's StoryBeat.
Basically, find something that you find interesting that will challenge you to keep going. Never get discouraged. I had 20 rejections. And if your dream is to be a writer, chase that dream. Don't stop. Don't let anybody tell you it's over. Because as my father would say, it's never over. You look at every option. And even after you've used up every option, you look and see, how can I recreate an option that maybe I can help me? Always get up, like a boxing match. When you get knocked down, you get right up at the count of 9. Don't let the referee count 10.
This is StoryBeat with Steve Cuden, a podcast for the creative mind. StoryBeat explores how masters of creativity develop and produce brilliant works that people everywhere love and admire. So join us as we discover how talented creators find success in the worlds of imagination and entertainment. Here now is your host, Steve Cuden.
Thanks for joining us on StoryBeat. We're coming to you from the Steel City, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My guest today, author Scott M. Hoffman, was a witness to historical events concerning major mob families. His book, Inside, tells the eye-opening tale of the son of a mobster who grows up learning firsthand the ins and outs of a major crime family. Scott absorbed the inner workings of the mob from his dad, who loyally served the Chicago outfit for over 55 years, never spending a day in prison. Now 74, Scott is a graduate of Long Island University, Brooklyn, with a BA in journalism. For 35 years, he worked for the city of Chicago in the departments of purchasing and finance. I've read Inside and can tell you it's a beautifully written, fascinating, and sometimes disturbing insider's look at what it's like to grow up as a mobster's son. So for all those reasons and many more, it's my distinct privilege to welcome the brilliant novelist Scott M. Hoffman to StoryBeat today. Scott, welcome to the show.
Thank you, and it's nice to meet you, Steve, and thank you for having me on. And when you talk about Pittsburgh, I'm very familiar with the Pittsburgh mob family. Very familiar.
Oh, is that right?
Exactly.
Have you spent time here?
Yes, I have. Many years ago, but I spent time.
This is a whole range of things I know absolutely zero about.
No, I'm familiar with them.
All right, let's go back in time a little bit. When you were a boy, did you start thinking about being a writer back then? Were you writing?
No, not. You know what? It was kind of strange. When someone's birthday came up, my mother would say, Scott, you always know what to say in a card and how to write it. So say something nice in the card about the person. Even if the person's not a nice person, you know how to say something nice. So I got to say, in a way, kind of the writing career kind of started at that point. You know, just writing birthday cards and greeting cards and everything.
Were you a reader as a kid? Did you read a lot?
Yeah, well, a lot of times I would go to the library and read a lot to try and get away from what I was seeing. Okay.
Right.
Because obviously I was having two educations. I was having a street education, and then I had to try and balance that against my formal education with kids in my neighborhood, in my grammar school, high school. I'm leading like two different lives, and it was a lot of pressure, especially what I was seeing, not only criminal activities, but the violent activities and everything else. I didn't have a child's life. I didn't have a bicycle. I didn't have birthday parties. Okay. In mob life, there's only one free day. On Thanksgiving, about 1:00, I'd be with my father and we're going out to collect juice money, which is interest on gambling and also interest on loans from loan sharks. We do that and we maybe come home about 8:00 at night. This was Thanksgiving. On Christmas Day, my father would wait till 1:00 and he'd say, let's let the kids open up their gifts. And at 1:00, we would start going around and same thing at home, 8:30. The only free day in mob life is Mother's Day.
Mother's Day.
Everybody goes to see mom. I'll never forget my father. He'd buy candy during the week. And then on Sunday, he'd go to a florist and get the flowers. And we would start going around the houses where either the husbands were away or the sons were away, in a federal facility. But nothing happened. No one got killed. No one got beat. Nothing happened on Mother's Day. Okay. But at 12:01 a.m. Monday, the action started again.
Oh, boy.
I was out there at times seeing things happen, shootings, beatings. But Mother's Day, nothing happened. You were safe on Mother's Day.
The character that you use as your protagonist in this story is Bobby, and he's what, 8 or 9 years old in the book, correct?
8 years old, I started going to Las Vegas with my father when I was 8 because he had the plan for 7 hotels, 7 casinos.
So this was your story that you told, really?
Correct. Just the book is fictional, but it's composites of real people and real events.
Was there anything in the book that was fictionalized at all, or was it all based on reality?
There was some things that were fictionalized, especially the part about Bobby getting married, because I've never been married.
Ah,
That was fictionalized.
so when you were a kid, you had to keep this all inside of you. You couldn't tell your friends, could you?
Correct. Because my father would always say, if you tell one person, that one person can burn you. So you got to keep it to yourself. And he said, don't be a radio, don't broadcast it. Just keep it to yourself. You'll never get hurt.
How did that make you feel as a kid that you had to keep this secret from all these other friends?
Well, it was very difficult because the kids were talking about what kids would talk about at 8, 9, and I had to just sit there and listen, and I had to keep everything to myself. And I'm thinking to myself, if you kids saw what I was seeing, you'd be having some very severe psychological problems. Okay, because in the life, you develop psychological scars. That's why it was easy for me to write the book. Once I started writing, everything started flowing, and I was going back 50, 55 years maybe in writing, but everything came back to me. I don't forget. What you see, you remember.
And so you're still remembering it. You still have flashbacks from back then?
Oh, yeah. When things come up today in mob life, I'll flash back to what was done 50 years ago, 60 years ago. Oh, yeah, sure. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Even though you were unable to tell your friends this, somehow you are in your heart a storyteller. You told this big story.
Oh, sure.
And was that part of your upbringing? Did you tell fictional stories or read fictional stories or love fictional stories? I'm trying to get inside how you got to the point of being a writer.
Well, the point I got to being a writer really was after I retired from the city of Chicago, which was June 30th, 2012. They always tell you when you retire, you got to keep your mind active. You got to, keep your mind active and also do exercising for the body, kind of a combination. I felt I wanted to write. Then I said to myself, I looked in the mirror and I said, self, what do you know? And self said, mob life. So it really started on like July 2nd. That Monday, I put myself on a writing schedule. Every morning at 7:30, I would start to write, at least 5 days a week. But in my case, since I didn't know how to do it on the computer, my final manuscript was 880 handwritten pages.
Handwritten.
Handwritten, yes.
And how did you get that typed up then?
Well, I eventually had to have it digitized, okay, because I would copy it and send it out, and no one was looking at it. And it was Dorrance Publishing Company in Pittsburgh, right where you're located, said to me, if you can digitize it, we're willing to at least take a look at it. Well, they did more than that, because once I had someone digitize it for me and I sent it to them, through the system, because I had Geek Squad help me,
Right.
company here. And within less than a week, they offered me a contract for the book.
The book is very unique. It's unique in several ways. First of all, it's the story of a young boy talking about the mob, which is all by itself unique. And then on top of it, you write it in a way that I don't think I've ever read another book that was not broken up at all. There's no chapters in your book. It's one long stream of consciousness. Was that intentional on your part?
Yes. Yes, it was. I wanted to leave the reader to make the decision when they wanted to stop. And I've had people tell me that they would get the book on Friday. They say, Scott, I couldn't put it down. And that's what I wanted, really, that I couldn't put it down. I wanted them to keep on going, and let them make the break, let them make the decision. But it was hard for people, when they were reading it.
It's a very, very challenging book to read from the violence that's in it. For me, it was challenging, even though I like violence in movies. I love James Bond and all those kinds of movies. I love Scorsese and all his mob movies.
They're not true, but...
Well, right. Of course, they're not true, but...
They're entertainment, yeah.
They are entertainment, and they have to be to a certain extent, because I think the reality would either be too boring or way too violent. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does, especially because people ask me, what did you leave out of your book, or did you water anything down in your book? And yes, I did. What happened to dogs.
What happened to dogs?
Yeah.
What happened? Dare I ask?
Yeah, sure. See, what it would be was with juice collectors, see, juice collectors and the street enforcers were guys who would collect business tax from businesses. They get half the money, okay? They get 50%. Just like when, you'll see a movie and they'll say, oh, they're putting a contract on somebody. Unless there's a number put on a guy's head, that's part of their job, okay? They don't get paid extra for contract killing unless there's a number on a guy's head. Otherwise, it's in the job spec, okay? So what happens with juice collectors, they try and get a little bit friendly with the guys. They'll look at a picture of the wife and the daughters and the sons, and then they'll say, oh, you have a dog? Oh, yeah, we have a dog. I have a dog. It's the guy who owes money. But if he's slow on the money, what'll happen is they'll do something to the dog.
Oh,
I said to myself, with all these people who have dogs, have pets, this would upset them. So I left that out. There was nothing mentioned about dogs.
do you know in the making of movies and TV shows, it's a well-known fact that the studios, generally speaking, dogs are something that you just don't hurt in a movie unless you're taking a big risk somehow. You can kill all the people you want in a movie, but not dogs. So I guess that was probably a smart play on your part not to put that in.
Well, I figured, because especially people who really love their dogs. And the reason why this was done was the next move would be, well, if you didn't like what we did to your dog, what do you think we're going to do to your kid?
Well, that's the message.
Yeah, it was the message of, look, we want the money, give us the money, or else there's going to be something, because, accidents can happen. It was always accidents can happen. So they'd scare people, and people would right away, look to come up with the money, whether their father gave them the money or somebody gave them the money, come up with the juice money.
Was that the phrase that paid? Something else could happen?
That would be it. They'd always say, there's accidents that people get hurt. And when I was 14 years old, my father explained to me, he waited till I was 14. He felt I was a little more mature. He probably could have done it when I was 10 after what I was seeing. But he explained to me what a sociopathic behavior was and what a psychotic behavior was. And the difference really is that a sociopathic behavior is someone who doesn't care about anybody and will do whatever that takes. A psychotic person is someone who has a violent temper, a violent nature, and it's like turning on a light switch. Something can just trigger it and they go, and until it gets out of their system, they won't stop. In other words, a lot of times I would ask wise guys when they were kids, what was their life like when they were a kid? And they would tell me, oh, they were in a lot of fights and everything. So they were violent kids who needed help in those days. But in those days, the parents, they weren't going to do anything. I understood because I always knew the guys were crazy, but I never knew the medical terms of what the difference was.
And how many people did you know that had those tendencies? Many?
Oh, yeah. Oh, sure. Because you have to remember, to do what they did, you have to have that personality. Not everybody can pull a trigger on a gun. Not everybody can beat everybody. That's why even with the outfit, we had guys that did different things. For example, in the book, I talk about the actor, okay? The guy who's the setup man on collecting juice or street money. And that would be the guy that would talk nice to the victim. And then he would say, you see that guy standing out by the car? That'd be the muscle guy. If you don't give me any money today at all, something that I can go back and tell the boss, okay, I got some money, I'll go back next week. This guy that you're seeing, he's going to come back, but he's not going to talk to you. Everything's going to be physical. You understand? Physical. And that'd be the truth. That'd be the truth. They would come right after him.
So for the listeners that might be wondering, Scott's book, Inside, is filled with stories that are similar to this. It's a one long stream of consciousness about what goes on in the outfit. And your father was an expert then in that world, wasn't he?
Yes, he was. That was one of the things when I graduated college, my father reported to Tony Accardo. Besides, he was originally a manager for Paul Ricca. It was a consigliere for Sam Giancana, and he reported to Tony Accardo, who was like the CEO. And in 1973, he reported as a consigliere to Joey Aiuppo, who took over day-to-day operations. And Sam Giancana was a protege of Paul Ricca, and he introduced my father to Paul Ricca. And the thing is, Tony Accardo, after I graduated college in June of 1971 from Long Island University, or LIU as the natives call it in New York, Tony Accardo says to me, I like Scott, why don't you come over? So I thought he wanted me to come with my father or something. He said, no, you come over for lunch, let's talk. And he's talking to me, he says, Scott, you're as good as your father. You're as smart as your father. I says, I can't be my father. I said, no son can be their father. And he says, well, how do you figure that? And I said to him, when I told my father that I was wanting to further my education, I went to a junior college first. And I talked to him and I said to him, Dad, I've got the application. I'm sending the application in. I'm not going to be, I'm only going to be an observer of mob life, not a participant. And people say to me, what's the difference? I said, when you're a participant, that's when you can get indicted for doing things. When you're an observer, you're on the outside just looking in and they have no evidence against you. There's nothing they can charge you with because you're not involved. And he said to me, Scott, he said, the worst thing that a parent can do is force a son or a daughter into something they really don't like, because 30 or 40 years later, they're going to come back and say, you forced me into this. You made me do this.
Mm-hmm.
He said, Scott, if what your father's telling you is really right, if that's how you feel and you just want to be an observer, that's great. But you got the ability. You could do it. And I said, thank you very much. But I could never be him.
So with everything that you knew from growing up in that, why did they let you go? Why didn't they force you into it?
Well, here's the story. Every mob family follows this rule that cops and kids are off limits, right?
Okay.
But now you say to yourself, well, why did this all happen to Scott? Well, it happened to Scott because my father, the 7 hotels and 7 casinos, the outfit at its height was bringing in $200 million a year in all criminal activities. And that's a lot of them. 100 million was coming from Las Vegas. Okay. So the first conversation in mob life is about money. The last conversation of the day is about money. So the rules didn't apply to Scott because Scott's father was bringing in this type of money. So it was okay for Scott to do, because Scott was always a quiet kid, very quiet. I was very quiet, very shy. And my father would say, don't ever worry, he'll never talk. And when guys would take me out, they'd always tell my father, yeah, we can see he's quiet. We're not worried. He's not going to rat us out. So the rules didn't apply to me. Okay, they didn't apply. They should have applied because I was a kid, but they didn't apply because of the money. That was the whole thing.
Did you wind up needing to do research for the book beyond your own experiences?
No, enough knowledge. I remember not only with the outfit, but I was dealing with other mob families, Detroit, Cleveland, Kansas City, who reported to Chicago, okay? And in 2022, the outfit, which is still around, there's 4 street crews, Kansas City and Philadelphia formed a partnership, okay? So things are still flying. They're still active. And I got some opinions on that Super Bowl, but that's not what we're here to talk about, okay?
No, we're definitely not here to talk about the Super Bowl, that's for sure.
That's something else. No, so I had a lot of experience. I mean, I knew a lot. I know a lot. I know how things started between the Kennedys and the outfit, how it went started and how it went bad and then went real bad, okay? I met Marilyn Monroe, okay, when I was almost 12 and a half years old.
Tell us what that was like.
Well, when she had just finished her last movie, The Misfits, with Clark Gable was in it.
Clark Gable.
Yeah, and in fact, the guy who wrote it was really a surprise to me, was Arthur Miller, who was her husband, but he was a playwright.
Right.
He was not a screenwriter, but he wrote it, and John Huston was the director. I met her in March of 1961, and in January 25th of 1961, her and Miller got divorced in Juarez, Mexico. So her and Clark Gable were supposed to go out and do promotional work because the premiere of the movie was in New York in 1961 in February. But Clark Gable died shortly after the filming, so it was all on her. So she came to Chicago to the Blackstone Hotel. They had her at the Blackstone because they didn't want her at the Conrad Hilton because of security and all. But the Blackstone Hotel is still open today. I'm sure the owners would love to know that on Saturday nights, that was mob prostitution there, okay? Every Saturday night.
Wow.
So I'm sure they like to know that because the downtown mob prostitution was in hotels and brought in $12 million a year, $1 million a month was coming in from that. So when I met her, the first thing I said to her is, my grandfather shot you for the Hugh Hefner July 1953 Playboy magazine, his first edition, the cover shot. And she said, what, and I told her, she says, oh yeah, your grandfather. Yeah. And she started to smile. She says, yeah, he was tough. He was tough. What happened was he had set her up for 7:30 in the morning in the studio, and she didn't show up till 12:30. And he had somebody coming in at 1 o'clock, a young couple who was getting married, because that's what my grandfather was, a portrait photographer. But the reason Hugh Hefner wanted to use them, in those days, they didn't have the airbrush. And by hand, my grandfather could put in the flesh tones on the negatives.
Hmm.
So if you even go online and look at that 1953 cover of Marilyn Monroe showing her arms and part of her breast that she shows and her legs, it all looks natural because that was his skill. He could do it by hand. So Hefner he had heard about him that he wanted him to do it. So when she came at 12:30 with her entourage, my grandfather says, you were supposed to be here at 7:30. And the reason he liked 7:30, because people were fresh at that time. They weren't tired. They hadn't, you got them right in the morning when they were just out of bed type of thing, and they were fresh. And she said, well, I came. And he said, so what? He told her to get the hell out. That's how he talked to her. Get the hell out of here. Her manager, road manager, calls Hugh Hefner, and Hefner calls my grandfather about 4 o'clock in the afternoon at the studio and says, look, I'll have her there tomorrow, 7:30. Is that okay? Is that okay? And my grandfather says, okay, if you have her here, I'll give her one more chance. But after that, don't call me and I'll give you back your $50. He got the money. His father, Glenn, was an accountant and gave him the $50 and gave it to my grandfather, which in 1953 was a lot of money.
Sure.
So after I was telling her that, she was laughing. She says, yeah, your grandfather was something. So then I told her, I says, my father said, told the girls in the hotels and casinos that the ones with the free drinks, that if they do a Maryland, they'll double, triple, quadruple their tips. So she said, what do you mean a Maryland? And I said, well, remember when you dyed your hair before Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, that movie? She said, yeah. She said, you mean like this? And she took her wig off. She came in as a brunette. She took her wig off and fluffed her hair and was blonde. And I said, yeah, that's what he told her. So she said, well, did they do it? I said, yeah. And their tips doubled, tripled, and quadrupled. So she said to me, she says, I got to talk to your father. He knows how to do it.
What did your dad do that kept him safe and sound and not in trouble?
Well, I think, it's kind of funny because I think he understood how the game was played. He'd always tell me, if you know the rules, you know how to play the game. If you don't know the rules, learn the rules before you try and play the game. And he was very talented at that. He knew how to navigate. When he became a manager for Paul Ricca, the big concern, even when Tony Accardo took over in 1943, the big concern was the black hands. And Big Al, as he referred to Al Capone, was a black hand in Brooklyn. But they were the big concern. And the reason they were the big concern was that black hands, they were not American born. They came from Sicily. As far as they were concerned, in mob life, they would accept someone who was from Northern Italy. They would accept them, but never in leadership capacity at all, never. And they wouldn't take anybody else. Now, my father played cards with these guys, so they trusted him. And the first thing he asked them when he took over, and he was maybe 23 when he took over, and these guys were late 30s, early 40s. They were a lot older. He says, what's your beef? What's bothering you? And in mob life, you never know when you're going to get paid. You never know. And they said, look, can we get paid every Friday? And my father said, look, if you go out in the street and hustle and you bring in the money, I'll talk with Paul because you're going to have to pay him tribute. Tribute is what you have to kick up to the boss. Okay, that's what it's called, tribute, when you kick up to the boss. And you have to kick up maybe 10, 15%. That'll be determined. So the first Friday, they're hustling on the street. Okay, they're really hustling on the street. And the reason they were called black hands was that they would come into your store and say, the neighborhood is changing and there's things happening and we can protect you. It was a form of protection. And if you said, hey, get out of here, I don't need you guys. There's nothing wrong with the neighborhood. What they would do is they'd put a picture of a black hand on the door and they'd come back the next day. And they'd say, we're hearing down the block that somebody had trouble. And the guy said, I don't know any guy having trouble. Get out of here. And that night, they would start breaking the windows. That's how it would start. Okay. And then they come back the next day. And the windows would, be broken. And they said, looks like you had trouble here. What happened? What happened? And the guy says, well, my windows got broken. We said, see, we're telling you there's problems. But if the guy didn't start paying, the next thing they did was burn his store down. That'd be the next thing. And then the third thing would be to go after the guy physically, go after him. See, in mob life, there's what's known as, rough a guy up or beat a guy. And to rough a guy up would mean maybe you give him a couple of slaps, you push him against the wall, a punch in the stomach. To beat a guy would mean to start kicking him in the ribs, see how many ribs you could break, use a small blackjack where it has these leather hand holders, physically do some real serious damage to somebody. So by that time, the guys in the stores got the message and they started paying street money, street extortion money. Okay. So these guys were really hustling on the street. My father talked with Paul Ricca. He said, Paul, they're willing to give you 10 to 15%. He said, okay, we'll pay them every Friday as long as they're bringing the money in. So they liked that very, very much. They liked that very much.
So your dad knew how to talk to people in a way that made them comfortable in some fashion.
Yeah, he could have been a salesman for IBM probably.
How did he get into the outfit in the first place?
Well, what happened was my father was actually born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. When he was 2 years old and his brother was 6 months old, their father died. And the mother had relatives in Chicago on the west side on Taylor Street, which was pretty much an Italian neighborhood, and some Jewish people lived there also. And what happened was how he met Sam Giancana really was while he was in high school. My father was a very good student, okay? Very, very good student. In fact, he would work in the cafeteria to get a free meal for lunch, and he met an assistant principal. This was maybe near the end of his junior year. So when senior year came, the assistant principal said to my father, "What do you want to do after you graduate high school?" My father really wanted to be a doctor. He wanted to be a surgeon, general surgeon. That's what he really wanted to do. And so the vice principal said, "Well, let me see what I can do." And he had a friend who worked in the admissions office at the University of Chicago. And he comes back and he tells my father, maybe a month and a half later, 2 months later, that he can get him an academic scholarship. He showed him my father's grades, get him an academic scholarship at the University of Chicago, and you could be a pre-med major. So my father was real excited. He goes home, he tells his mother. His mother says, "That's great. You got to go to work." And that ended that. But how we met Sam Giancana was when he was in high school. He was a member of the swimming team. The JPI was a Jewish community center. Was across Taylor Street. You had to cross Taylor Street. And Sam Giancana was there with his 42s. Now, the 42s used to hang out at a cafe called the 42nd Street Cafe, which I think was a play on Broadway, 42nd Street and all.
Sure.
And Sam Giancana says it's going to cost you like 2 or 3 pennies, which was a lot of money in those days, to cross the street. My father says, "I don't have 2 or 3 pennies." And he said, "Well, you're not going across the street." And so Sam Giancana takes a little knife and sticks it in my father's hand. So my father leaves, he pulls the knife out and maybe puts some soap on it. And the next day he goes back. And same thing, Sam Giancana says, "Well, you got to, 2 or 3 pennies. That's what it'll cost you to go across the street to this place you want to go." And so my father says, "Well, okay, here's what I'll give you." And he punched him and knocked him down. And the 42s start moving up on my father. And Sam Giancana gets up and says, "Wait a minute," to these guys. He says, "What's so important to cross the street?" And he says, "Well, I'm on the swim team. I'm going to practice." And he said, "What's your name?" My father told him. And he said, "Well, can you teach me how to swim? I don't know how to swim." So my father says, "Yes, I can, but we got to change your name from Sam Giancana to Sam Rosenberg. Are you okay with that?" "Okay, yeah." He said, "I'm fine with Sam Rosenberg. Let's do it." So I'd ask my father in later years, because when I'd see pictures of Sam Giancana in the water, he was always floating on his back. But I never saw him like do the crawl or the backstroke or, actually swim. And I said to my father, "How come, you were a good swimmer, you couldn't teach him?" He said, "No, it wasn't I couldn't teach him. He was so tense in the water. I thought he was going to pull out a 38 and shoot the waves. He was very tense." He said all he could do was, on his back float, but he was very tense in the water. It was like he was trying to strangle the waves. So he said, I knew all I could do was get him to float on his back. And he was happy with it. It was okay. And from that point on, they became close. My father told him that he would need a job. He said, "Can you drive a beer truck?" And my father said, "Yes." I don't know if he could or he couldn't, but he said, "Yes, I can." Because they had to make the beer runs up to Milwaukee. And he says, "I'll be the shotgun." And he says, "I'm going to be carrying a shotgun." And he would. Sam Giancana carried the shotgun. Because what would happen is other robbers would try and hijack the beer in those days. This is before, Prohibition and everything. So they had some interesting runs going up to Milwaukee. And Milwaukee, eventually, their mob family reported to Chicago. Okay, so it's kind of strange. But that's how it all started. And the more Sam Giancana talked with my father, he would tell Paul Ricca, he said, "Dave Hoffman is a smart guy. He's a young guy, but don't let the age fool you. He's a smart guy. He knows how to do things, and he could really help us." And so they offered my father a position, as the manager. But my father always worked legit jobs. He never worked mob jobs, okay? He never worked no-show jobs. And people would say to me, "Well, how could he do that if he's running Las Vegas?" And I said, "Well, this is where the movie Casino was not straight, okay? Because what it was to get a license in Nevada, you had to be legit, okay? When you applied for the application, well, he would talk with business people. That's where I'd be going. And he'd get business people that he knew and met and who were successful in their business and wanted to open up a casino. And he said, "Fine." But he said, "The thing is, you have to bring in hotel people." He said, "Do you understand?" He said, you might be good in your profession, but you don't know the hotel business. We don't want any problems. So they agreed, fine, sure, they would do it. Now, as far as the casino, again, the movie didn't really play it out right. I mean, they made it look like, oh, the Alfred ran the movie, because it was about the Alfred casino. I know. But how he worked the casino was he knew Mayor Lansky, what Lansky was doing with Batista after World War II in Havana. And basically in Havana, what Lansky set up was like a minor Las Vegas. But in 1957, when Castro came, everything became nationals. And my father said Lansky shouldn't have fought it. He wasted too much time because all the American businesses left Havana, they left Cuba because they weren't going to let Castro, the state, take them over. They'd make no money. So they left. So what happened was guys who worked for Lansky, who ran the casinos he had like 4 small hotels in Havana. My father got in touch with them and he brought them in to run the casinos. He would stay in touch with them and he'd talk to them, about revenue, what's going on. But they actually ran the casinos. So that's why the Nevada Gaming Commission never knew who my father was. And my father never wound up in the Black Book. Okay. If you wound up in the Black Book, like Sam Giancana, Tony Spilotro, a lot of other names, you couldn't go into a casino. If you went into a casino and got caught, the casino lost their license. There was no suspension. There was no fine. The license was pulled from them. So they would lose the casino. So since my father ran it that way, and that's how he would always run it, he'd always say to me, Scott, look, you go to the library, you read a lot of books about people. Henry Ford, I know you read books about these people, which I did, biographies. You know why they were successful? Because they brought people in that knew what they were doing. And they weren't micromanaged. He said, you don't micromanage someone who knows what he's doing. Like you're an expert in computers. If I wanted to use you in a bank robbery and going into computers, I would turn it over to you and I would not micromanage you because you know what you're doing. And that's why he was successful in Las Vegas. That's why. Because my father would always say, you want to be 3 steps ahead of everybody. And I'd say, well, Dad, isn't the saying 2 steps? He said, if you're 2 steps and you lose a step, that means that they're an arm length away from you. And he said, Scott, in life, you always want to be the hunter. You never want to be the game. Never the game, always the hunter.
That's very profound. I do want to ask you about the book. Back to the book for a moment.
Yeah.
Inside, how long did it take you to write the book?
About 2 years.
2 years. And were you working on it every day?
Yeah, except the weekends. I would take the weekend off.
Take the weekends off. And about how many pages would you write a day?
Well, it all varied because I had to be careful because I didn't want my hand to get sore. Okay. That could become an issue. That if your hand gets sore, you can't write.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I wrote time. In other words, I wrote from 7:30 to 8:30, and then I would stop.
And did you then revise the book, or is the book pretty much as you wrote it?
Oh, yeah. No. That's why it took longer, because I would write a rough draft. Basically, it was a draft first, and then I went back and rewrote it and changed some things, after reading it the second time. I wrote different things in, changed things.
Did you use an outline or did you just write?
No, I just wrote because I knew the subject.
And then how did you develop the characters? Did you just base all the characters on real people?
Yes.
And then you made up the wife and the family?
Yeah, that was later on near the end of the book.
Near the end of the book. Yeah, no, that's right. And did you find anything that really made it very challenging for you to finish? Was there anything that happened during the writing process over 2 years that you then thought to yourself, wow, this is really too hard to do, or anything like that?
No, never.
Never. You just kept going. And of course, you have a degree in journalism, right?
Correct.
Did you treat it like you were writing a report, like a journalistic report?
No, I wrote it in the sense as if somebody asked me, what was mob life about? Tell us some stories about what mob life was about.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what it is. I'm telling stories about what mob life was about.
Well, that's for sure.
That's the approach I took.
It's one long series of very compelling stories about what life was like. And as you were writing this, again, stream of consciousness that has no breaks in it, no chapter headings, nothing like that. It just keeps going. Was there ever a point where you thought to yourself, I don't know which direction to go, or was it always obvious to you?
No, it was always obvious to me because of my experience. I knew where things were going. I knew what direction was going. I knew how the characters were going to go. I knew everything was going to happen.
What would you say you've done over the years to deal with pressure? I know you had pressure as a kid. There's pressure in turning out whatever you're doing for the city of Chicago and so on. How do you handle pressure?
Well, how I handle pressure, I always say to myself, is this the worst it could be? If there's something worse, let's think about what is worse than this. It's like if you ask a doctor, you ask any doctor, whether it's your private physician, your audience, their primary care doctor, besides death, what is the next worst thing that you wouldn't want happen to you? And you know what they would tell you? To lose my mind. That's the next thing a doctor is going to say. Dying is the worst, but to lose my mind, because a lot of these doctors have had a mom and a dad who've had Alzheimer's, dementia, however, whatever you want to call. Not every one of them, of course, but that's what they would say, to lose my mind. Okay.
Unfortunately, I've seen that in my life, and I would not want to lose my mind either.
Yeah. So you know what I'm talking about.
I do.
So that's why when I'd say, I'd always look at, well, how bad is it? How bad is it that what I'm doing now? Is this the worst it's going to be? Okay, if this is the worst, now we can work around it. We know how to move things. We know what to do.
So I've been having one of the most intriguing and fascinating conversations I've had in quite some time with Scott Hoffman, especially about his book Inside, which, by the way, you can find at Amazon.com as both a paper book and also in Kindle. I'm wondering, in all these experiences that you've shared with us, do you have any experiences that you can share that are either weird, quirky, offbeat, strange, or just plain funny, even more so than what you've told us?
Yeah, it'd be funny. I remember when I was about 9 years old, this guy, this mobster, and he says to me, Scott, if you move out of the neighborhood, 3 things can happen, and 4 of them are bad. And I said, wait a minute. If you move out of the neighborhood, and 3 things are bad, wouldn't 3 things be bad? He said, no, because there's always something around the corner that you don't know that's coming. Well, then I said, what are the odds are that? So you'd think the odds would be 60-40, right? Or 90-10. He tells me it's 60-50. I said, wait a minute.
60-50.
60-50, that's 110. He says, Scott, always remember, you want the edge. You always want the edge. You want the home court advantage. And he's serious. You look at his face, he was just as serious as could be. Just as serious, yeah. So, I mean, things would happen, and they would be funny, but they weren't supposed to be funny, but they happened, and they were funny. I'll never forget, I asked Big Louie for 4 tires for my car, right? So he brings me 4 tires. No air in the tires. I said, Big Louie, I needed 4 tires. And he says, Scott, here's the 4 tires. Okay. They were off the truck. He was selling stuff. Well, they were hot. The tires were hot. And I said, Louie, where's the air? And he said, Scott, you never asked about air. You just said 4 tires. So, I mean, guys would say stuff and do stuff that was funny, but, it was part of life. But I mean, he was serious. He said, all right, I'll get the air. But he said, next time, tell me you want air in the tires. I said, okay, Big Louie, I'll tell you next time. I want tires. I'll tell you air in the tires. Okay. He says, yeah, okay. This is what would happen.
You got to have air in the tires. There's no doubt about it.
Correct.
So last question for you today, Scott. You've already given us all kinds of interesting things to think about and chew on, but I'm wondering, do you have a solid piece of advice for writers who are maybe trying to figure out how to write their first book or get into the business a little bit, or maybe someone who's in a little bit trying to get to the next level?
Well, I would tell a beginner that write something you know about if that's the direction you want to go. If you want to be a historian and write other things, but basically try and find something that you, maybe while you don't have the personal experience, but something you like, something you enjoy, because it's always easier to write something you like, you enjoy, than just to constantly do research on something. That's fine. If you want to be that type of a writer, sure, you can be that type of a writer. I mean, but basically find something that you find interesting that will challenge you to keep going. And that's what I would tell people. Never get discouraged. I had 20 rejections. 18 times it came back in the same FedEx box I sent it. It was never opened. The other 2 times I got a letter saying that they don't deal with unsolicited work, or that they only deal with literary agents. So, if you have a dream, and if your dream is to be a writer, chase that dream. Don't stop. Chase that dream. And don't let anybody tell you it's over. Because as my father would say, it's never over. You look at every option. And even after you've used up every option, you look and see, how can I recreate an option that maybe I can help me? Don't give up. Don't ever give up. You'd always say, never concede. Always get up. Like a boxing match. When you get knocked down, you get right up at the count of 9. Don't let the referee count 10. And that's what I would tell a writer, because I went through it. Okay. I'll never forget one day, the temperature in Chicago, the high temperature was 4 below zero. I go out to dinner. I'm listening on the radio. It's 8 below zero. I come home and there's a FedEx box. There it is of my manuscript that came back, wasn't open. Nobody looked at, sent it right back to me. And the next day I'm at FedEx and the lady's name was Catherine, a middle-aged lady, maybe close to 60. She says, Scott, you got something here. Don't give up. Keep going. Keep going. Don't be discouraged. Keep going. And that's what I would tell a writer. And as far as the next level, you have to find someone, as I did, who is a book blogger, book promoter, someone who has the contacts that can get a hold of people like yourself and others to get the saturation, to get out there so you can talk about what your work is. But always be positive. Even the rejections you get, and you'll get rejections, but never, ever stop chasing your dream. To chase a dream, you have to have a dream. And if you don't have a dream, it's going to be difficult to be a writer because the rejections, I would tell people, oh, I got this number of rejections. And they would tell me, this is when I do the in-person presentation. They'd say to me, Scott, if I got 1 or 2 rejections, I would have stopped. And I said, I got 20 and I didn't stop. I kept going and going and going because that was a dream I had. Because once I started writing, I realized that I had something to tell. I had a story to tell. Okay. Just like I have knowledge of so many other things that, if I can find someone that's willing to do a movie of the book, I can make a lot of money of them because I got a lot of things to tell them beyond this.
Well, I think that this book should be a movie. It would make a very good movie, and hopefully that it will get there someday. Scott Hoffman, this has been an absolutely wonderful hour on StoryBeat, and I can't thank you enough for your time and certainly all of your great energy and the wisdom that you shared with us today about stuff that I knew very little about. Thank you so much for your time.
And thank you very much for having me on your podcast.
And so we've come to the end of today's StoryBeat. If you like this episode, won't you please take a moment to give us a comment, rating, or review on whatever app or platform you're listening to. Your support helps us bring more great StoryBeat episodes to you. StoryBeat is available on all major podcast apps and platforms, including Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, iHeartRadio, TuneIn, and many others. Until next time, I'm Steve Cuden, and may all your stories be unforgettable.